This is TWiT.
Last Thursday, March 21st, was by all measures a rough day for Apple. Not only, as I mentioned, did the tech press explode with truly hair-on-fire headlines about critical, unfixable, unpatchable, deeply rooted cryptographic flaws rendering Apple's recent M-series ARM-based silicon incapable of performing secure cryptographic operations.
Incapable.
Can't be done, which is the topic we'll be spending the rest of the day's podcast looking at in some detail once we get this thing started. Because actually it's super interesting. But before that, also last Thursday, the U.S. Department of Justice was joined by 15 other states and the District of Columbia, which wishes it was a state but isn't, in a lawsuit alleging that Apple has been willfully and deliberately violating Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, I'm just going to share 5 sentences from the DOJ's comments, which were delivered last Thursday. They read, "As our complaint alleges, Apple has maintained monopoly power in the smartphone market, not simply by staying ahead of the competition on the merits, but by violating federal antitrust law, period. Consumers should not have to pay higher prices because companies break the law." Okay. "We allege that Apple has employed a strategy that relies on exclusionary, anti-competitive conduct that hurts both consumers and developers. For consumers, that has meant fewer choices, higher prices and fees, lower quality smartphones, apps and accessories, and less innovation from Apple and its competitors. For developers, that has meant being forced to play by rules that insulate Apple from competition." Okay, now, this is not clearly a podcast about antitrust law. We all know I'm not an attorney, nor am I trained in the law. So I have no specific legal opinion to render here. However, I've been a successful small business founder, owner, operator throughout my entire life. And I'm certainly a big fan and believer in the free enterprise system and in the principles of capitalism. But I also appreciate that this system of competition is inherently unstable. It has a natural tendency for the big to get bigger through acquisition and the application of economies of scale and leverage. That same system that creates an environment which promotes fair competition can be abused once sufficient power has been acquired. Those of us of a certain age have watched Apple being born, then fall, only to rise again from the ashes. My own first commercial success was the design, development, production, and sales of a high-speed, high-resolution light pen for the Apple II, which allowed its users to interact directly with the Apple II's screen. To my mind, there's no question that as a society, we are all richer for the influence that Apple's aggressive pursuit of perfection has had on the world. Things as simple as product packaging will never be the same. But for some time, we've been hearing complaints about Apple's having taken this too far. It's understandable for competitors to complain and to ask the government to step in and do something. At some point, that becomes the government's very necessary role, just as we saw previously when the same thing happened with Microsoft. And some would argue it ought to happen again with Microsoft. For many years, the U.S. government has done nothing, while Apple has continued to grow and continued to aggressively use its market power to increase its shareholders' wealth. The question is, when does use of market power become abuse of market power? The next few years will be spent in endless depositions and expert testimony working to decide exactly what sort of cage Apple needs to be constrained within. One thing we know is that many of the arguments Apple will be making on its own behalf will involve security. The security inherent in its closed messaging system, the inherent security of its closed app store, things we've touched on many times in this podcast. Apple will allege that by keeping its systems closed, it is protecting its users from unseen nefarious forces. But, for example, the presence of Signal and WhatsApp in the App Store and on Apple devices, which create freely interoperable, super secure cross-platform messaging, suggests that Apple's own messaging technology could work similarly if they wished it to. During the news coverage of this since Thursday, I've encountered snippets of evidence which suggests that the government has obtained clear proof of Apple's true motives, where Apple's technology has been designed to support Apple's interests rather than those of its users. In any event, and, maybe those are aligned. That's really the question, right? Are Apple's interests and its users' interests perfectly aligned? Nothing is going to happen on this front for a long time. Years will pass, and this podcast will be well into 4 digits by the time anything is resolved with the DOJ's antitrust lawsuit. The way things have been going, it seems to me much more likely that the laws being written and enacted within the European Union today will be forcing Apple's hand long before the DOJ finishes making its case. All that may eventually be required will be for the U.S. to force Apple to do the same thing that they're already doing over in Europe here as well. But as for whether Apple-designed silicon cannot perform secure cryptographic operations, that is something this podcast can speak to authoritatively, and we'll be doing so once we've caught up with some more interesting news and feedback.
Good. I always said back in the day, in fact, it was funny how you began this with the good old days of Apple, because back in the day when the Department of Justice was suing Microsoft, I always said if Apple were as big and powerful as Microsoft, they'd be just as bad, but they aren't. In fact, they almost went out of business in 97. And now that they are even a little bit bigger than Microsoft, they're just as... It's what happens.
It is exactly what happens. And it's not that anybody is a bad person. They'll argue that the executives argue that it's their job to maximize shareholder wealth.
That's capitalism.
Yes, exactly. And so it's a fundamental property that there need to be constraints. And of course, in the US, we have those. Right. It's painful to get them, but it's interesting. And I think I heard Renee saying that he thought he was going to have to spin up another podcast in order to keep track of this. So
I'm sure.
I'm not gonna bother with that.
No, we're not going to do it. No. It'll go on, and we'll mention it once in a while, and that'll be it.
Right. It will. This thing will go for years. Exactly as it happened with Microsoft.
Hey, it's Leo Laporte. I hope you've enjoyed this little snippet from Security Now. If you want the whole show, you can get it at our website, twit.tv/SN. Of course, you can subscribe to Security Now on your favorite podcast, or just click one of the links below.